Good evening, welcome to Scotland at 7. I'm Gordon Ross and welcome to what might be my final programme for Broadcasting Scotland for a little while. Anyway, it's the 8th of July and joining me in the studio this evening is Brian Liddy. Brian's one of our members of staff, valued members of staff, and a man with a great deal of experience, particularly in the museum industry, I understand, Brian. Anyway, welcome back to the programme, Brian. We'll talk a little bit later on.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Okay, well, let's get on with the coronavirus first of all. As of 2 o'clock today, a total of 2,323,350 people in Scotland have now been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK Government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 2,016,901 have been confirmed negative. 306,449 have tested positive. There are 2,802 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test. Although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There were 4 new reported deaths today of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have now died from complications caused by the coronavirus COVID-19 infection stands now at 7,744. This number includes only those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 401 were in hospital last night, with 38 of whom were in intensive care. Now, as of 8 a.m. this morning, 3,900,864 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 2,825,886 have received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show that 128,336 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 35 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings and not just hospitals. And now to tonight's main headlines. The First Minister's COVID statement. The Greens have welcomed the First Minister's cautious language on COVID. In her media briefing today, the First Minister said that the 7-day average for new COVID cases now appears to be falling, and that by holding off making a final decision on lowering the current coronavirus regulations, the Scottish Government has better data on which to make an informed decision on what changes she will announce to the Scottish Parliament next Tuesday. Ms Sturgeon reminded us that the virus is still dangerous and is still taking lives, although in fewer numbers than previously. She warned that many people are suffering from serious illness from COVID and were of the younger age group, and urged caution when the vaccine programme was still being rolled out. While the rate of hospitalisation was now much lower in absolute terms due to the high number of cases, the numbers are still high and putting some pressure on the NHS. On face masks, the First Minister said that face coverings, physical distancing, rigorous hand hygiene and advising on good ventilation are going to continue to be important mitigations in protecting ourselves and others from the virus, perhaps for some time yet. The Scottish Greens welcomed the cautious language from the First Minister on COVID restrictions and called for support for people to stay safe. Now, Brian, this really contrasts, doesn't it, markedly with the attitude of the British government and their planned relaxing of lockdown on the 19th of this month and the removal of the requirement to wear a face mask. Would you say that the First Minister is not just being more cautious, but do you think perhaps it's a better idea to keep wearing face masks just now until we see how the containment of the virus is going?
Yes, I think that the First Minister is right to be cautious. This whole notion of Freedom Day in England is, for me, still quite alarming. It's good to hear that maybe numbers might be slowing, but not by very much. We're still amongst the highest anywhere in the world. I think in the UK yesterday there were more than 30,000 new cases, which is more than the whole of the EU.
I understand it was something like a 35% rise on the previous week cases.
Yes, and although numbers in general may be slowing or maybe falling, there are more young people in hospital, I believe, at the moment, or as many young people in hospital with COVID now as there was in January during the second wave. So we're not out of this yet, and so I would say that we need to be cautious.
Would you say, Brian, that there's been too much emphasis on this, what now appears to be a bit of a myth, that younger people are somehow more robust and are not going to end up hospitalised in the same way as their older relatives were at the beginning of the pandemic. Would you say that myth has now been busted?
I'd like to think so, but probably not. Again, not being an epidemiologist, but I think maybe it's a combination of the new variant, the Delta variant, being more transmissible, which would probably include younger people, I suppose, but also older people have been vaccinated. So those two things together, I think, mean that younger people are more at risk. And certainly other countries are beginning to vaccinate young people quicker than we are, America, the EU. So I think that maybe we need to start to do that and prioritise young people more than we are already.
I was going to ask you, Brian, would you say that that the older generation are actually much more likely to keep their social distance? Because young people, let's face it, when they go out together, they drink alcohol, they enjoy themselves. They're not going to be quite as on their guard, are they? They're bound to let their guard drop sometimes and just revert back to the normal behaviour. And surely that must make them more vulnerable to this and might explain this huge spike in cases, not just because of the vaccinated older generation, but because the young generation is, shall we say, not as rigorous in applying the restrictions.
That sounds plausible to me. Being a bit of an oldie myself now, when the announcement was made some time ago that we could now hug carefully and things like that.
Careful hugging, that's a new thing for me.
I was one of those people who would probably have said, well, I don't really want to go back to hugging.
You're not a hugger.
But yes, I mean, on my way here today, I was walking through town and there were very few people wearing face masks. And okay, it was a lovely day. We were all outdoors. But I think that at this stage, the First Minister's right. We just need to be cautious and we can't relax measures too soon. What Westminster is advocating is, to my mind, a cliff edge. And what
they seem to be very fond of these cliff edges, don't they? That everything has to stop on a certain date.
Yes, date's not data, whereas the First Minister, I think, is the opposite. She's data, not dates.
She's basing it on what the scientists and the medics are telling her.
Yes, and even in the announcement today, she was quite, at pains to say that she has not made a decision yet. Holyrood will not make a decision until they'll announce something on Tuesday, but they won't make a decision until they see what's happening in terms of figures.
I noticed in the newspapers particularly that the SNP government had provided a provisional date of the 9th of August as a target. Do you think that they're going to be far enough on with the vaccination programme by that time, since we've got 4 weeks basically until we reach that level, to vaccinate enough young people to relax the restrictions?
Oh, you're talking about crystal ball territory and stargazing there, and as reporting Scotland today, our correspondent managed to get a question to the First Minister in the briefing today, the COVID briefing today, and as the First Minister replied to our correspondent's question, she said that she's willing to make hard decisions, unpopular decisions, because they have to be made. It's like, this is not a popularity contest and lives are at stake. Mm-hmm. So she's not going to just do what she thinks people would want her to do, the way Boris Johnson and his cabinet are doing at the moment in England. She basically said we're going to do the opposite and take our time and be careful, which is sensible, in my opinion.
Would you say that it's fair to characterise the British government's approach to this as being is more important for Boris Johnson and his administration to basically save businesses, to promote the economy ahead of people's health? Would you say that they are doing that they are basically taking a risk with people's health in order to keep the economy going?
Yeah, I don't know if they would ever admit it so blatantly or so obviously, but yes, I think it seems that is the case. It's like I would suspect that that's the rationale, that's the reason behind their approach. And again, I would say that explains the opposite here in Holyrood. It explains why the First Minister is cautious. She put lives before profits.
Okay, Brian Wilson, we're going to leave that for the moment and move on to another related topic tonight. And England has to end its quarantine for fully vaccinated travellers from amber list countries. Holidaymakers from England travelling to amber list countries will not have to quarantine on return if they are fully vaccinated. But UK citizens living overseas will not be able to prove their vaccine status unless they have been vaccinated overseas. The rule change, which will take effect from the 19th of July, could open up swathes of European tourist destinations, such as France, Spain, Portugal and Greece, to travellers. Though countries could impose their own quarantine rules on arrivals from England. The Scottish Government still requires travellers from amber list countries to self-isolate for 10 days. Again, this seems like another one of those cliff edges. The British Government very keen to try and get the tourism industry restarted. And I'm guessing that particularly the aviation industry is in a terrible mess at the moment, really desperate for the door to open to let them get back into business.
Yes, and today it was Grant Shapps who made the announcement. I think he's their transport minister in the cabinet, and who made these announcements about people. We can now travel abroad, and we won't have to isolate when we return if we're double vaccinated, which just seems very presumptuous to me. It's as if the government in Westminster are presuming, because they think that we should be allowed to travel abroad and take
other
flights.
Countries must agree with them.
Yes, they think that they'll be happy to take us in and let us in. And I think with the COVID levels at the moment in England, I don't think that will be the case. So we might put a country on the amber list, but would that country let us freely enter? I don't think they would.
Do you think this is a case of wishful thinking, that perhaps somebody should hold a mirror up to the British state and say, look at the COVID numbers you've got, and then you can understand why we don't want your travellers coming into our country?
Yeah, and I think maybe if they did that, mirror would shatter or something. It's just not going to happen. The other thing that Grant Shapps announced today as part of the lifting of COVID restrictions was that they realised, as he's the travel secretary, he said that they realised that there is a shortage of HGV, heavy goods vehicle drivers, in the UK, which is possibly going to lead to shortages on supermarket shelves. So the answer to that is simply to ask the already tired goods drivers to drive for longer hours and take less breaks. So again,
and probably for no higher salaries than they currently get.
Yes, and so again, it's just this car crash between Brexit and COVID, which again Westminster knew was going to happen, but they went ahead with Brexit even though they knew that we were about to enter into a pandemic, and this is the result. It's classic Westminster behaviour.
They would just rather that we all suffered in favour of their particular ideology.
Yes, and again, just opening up without due regard. When they ease travel restrictions, then COVID figures are bound to rise even further. And if we're supposed to be worried about the backlog in the NHS, then surely we should be trying to keep numbers as low as possible so that we can continue to have routine surgery and the like as we're coming out of the pandemic. But again, it's Westminster just doesn't seem to be taking any attention of these kinds of complex issues.
To take up the point that you were making there about other medical procedures, there were figures revealed this afternoon in the news, in the mainstream media, that showed that the NHS in England and Wales, the waiting times for routine operations have now got, the waiting list, I beg your pardon, for routine operations has now reached over 5 million people waiting presumably for important operations. I would imagine things like hip replacements and things like this. Are we, do you think, in as bad a situation in Scotland at the moment as that? It doesn't seem that way here.
I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but I would like to think that the very fact that the Scottish Government is increasing funding to the NHS is bound to help. There are more nurses, I believe, more doctors.
Of course, paying them more too.
Paying them more, in recognition of what they've been through and what they've done to keep us as a country together. I don't know. It's just I mean, again, this conversation, this chat is all coming out of Grant Shapps talking about, as a transport secretary, about easing restrictions for COVID, and yet it impacts on
Everyone.
health.
Yeah.
Yes, it's,
and of course,
the economy.
Scotland can't close its borders to travellers coming from England who may have been to some of these amber list countries and then decide to go and visit their relatives north of the border. And there's no way of preventing them from doing so, is there?
Not that I'm aware of, not without there being huge implications for the First Minister and the press.
Constitutional
that would be hugely
crises.
unpopular. Yes, although she says that she's willing to take unpopular decisions, so if she could tackle that one, I think I'd be grateful.
Certainly Wales successfully managed to close their border with England during the height of the pandemic, and nothing seemed to be said about that.
No, it was nicely done, I think. It was a very light touch. Police were on the border making spot checks and saying, "Are you sure that you're doing the right thing?" And I think a lot of people did, probably say, they didn't realise that there was a difference between the rules in Wales and England. They thought everything was easing up because England was easing up. And so, again, just that's the media doesn't make it clear, and people think they can go wherever they want. When that's not really always the case. And again, Grant Shapps saying you can now go abroad wherever you want without checking with countries in advance as to whether they want.
Of course, Grant Shapps, easy for him to say this, isn't it? But if somebody were to travel, maybe tens of thousands of people all get on a plane to Malaga or somewhere like that, then the authorities there go, "Oh, wait a minute, we're not going to let you in here without 10 days quarantine."
And I just think it's extremely risky for anybody to travel at the moment. I mean, you might think, okay, you're on the green list. The country we're going to is on the green list at the moment. You get there, and then there's a COVID spike, and the shutter comes down, and
you
there's
can't
a
get
scramble
home
for
either,
flights
can you?
back. Yeah, costs go up, and you end up having to isolate. I mean, people we just should not be travelling unless it's urgent. Holidays should still be out of the question, in my opinion.
Okay, so, let's move on from the subject of holiday travel and on to the subject of evil. This time, evil laws. The Cabinet Secretary, Michael Gove, has said that he is looking at scrapping the English laws for English votes, or EVIL, brought in by the then Prime Minister David Cameron following the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. EVIL was David Cameron's response to the West Lothian question. However, it's been seen as making Scottish politicians in the House of Commons second-class MPs. Michael Gove's motives for repealing the EVIL laws have more to do with his plans of bolstering the United Kingdom in the face of a majority of MSPs in the Scottish Parliament being elected on a manifesto commitment for a new Scottish independence referendum. The SNP's shadow Cabinet Office spokesperson Stuart Hosey MP said that no amount of tinkering around the edges will change the fundamental flaws within the broken Westminster system or protect Scotland from the damaging policies of Tory government Scotland rejects. Mr Hosey said the only way to keep Scotland safe from long-term damage of Tory austerity cuts, Brexit and Westminster power grabs is for Scotland to become an independent country with the full powers needed to build a strong, fair and equal recovery. Now, this has been rumbling on for a while, hasn't it? This so-called evil English votes for English laws, which basically made a mockery, did it not, of the entire purpose of Parliament in Westminster, which was to include all of the smaller nations in the decision-making of the entire British state. And since 2014, Scotland's MPs have not been allowed to vote on matters like that.
Yes, I think I've got a sneaking suspicion, though, that I might miss. If they scrap evil, I might be quite sorry to see it go, I think is the way around I should put it a little bit.
So what's your reasoning there, Brian?
I used to quite enjoy watching things like Prime Minister's Questions and seeing people like Andrew Bowie, the Scottish Tory MP, standing up, contributing to a debate only for the Speaker to gently and politely remind him, said, "I think you'll find that you've got nothing to do with this because you're Scottish. This is an English matter." And so I used to kind of quite enjoy that, and that's not going to happen anymore. So I'll miss those exchanges.
So this business of you're British when it suits the British government, but you're Scottish when it doesn't, seems to be there's a contradiction here, isn't there? It doesn't It doesn't work.
It's a paradox, and I'm tempted to say it's a paradox within an enigma wrapped in. It's a paradox that again, it's always I found it's not funny, but it does make me smile. Evil was brought in to tackle the West Lothian question, whereby English and Welsh MPs in Westminster wouldn't have been allowed to vote on Scottish devolved issues or Welsh devolved issues.
But devolution hasn't worked the other way. There are no English devolved powers. Or English devolved competencies. They just don't exist.
And although the West Lothian question was a reality, it did exist. That was the case. But at the same time, the very fact that they're having to scrap it shows that ultimately there is an imbalance within Westminster. Scotland, it can send as many SNP MPs and Green MPs, pro-India MPs, as it wants to Westminster, and it will not make one blind bit of difference because they're outnumbered by English
Despite
MPs.
what Mrs Thatcher claimed during her term in office, that if Scotland wanted independence, they just had to have a majority of pro-independence MPs, and that would be it, magically done.
Exactly, and so the whole idea of the West Lothian question, to say that it wasn't fair, that it favoured Scottish MPs, is really just it's a mirage. It's that the reality is the complete opposite. We will always be outnumbered. We will always be outvoted. We haven't. When was the last time we voted for a Tory government? 50 odd years ago, and it doesn't make any difference. So it's good to see that they had to have maybe acknowledged that evil just does not work and was not a good idea. It was the result of a knee-jerk reaction by David Cameron the day after the referendum. The independence
he panicked,
referendum,
in other words, didn't he?
Yes.
About the reaction of English voters to what had happened in the Scottish referendum.
Yes, and I think it was the start. That was it ushered in Brexit almost, or it was the start of.
Would you agree, Brian, that the whole idea of English votes for English laws basically destroys the whole pretense of having a union, because you've then got individual countries only voting on matters that are important to them. And that really makes a mockery of the whole idea of all of these parliaments sitting together in London and making decisions jointly. It no longer exists, does it?
Yes, and there was another problem with the evil in that if votes in Westminster have an impact on Scotland, even if it was an evil...
because of the funding arrangements?
Yes, I mean, the English NHS and the Scottish NHS are separate, they're different, they're differently organised. If England voted to make a change on the NHS funding, then that, through Barnett consequentials, would have a direct impact on the Scottish NHS. And so to say that Scottish MPs shouldn't be allowed to have an opinion on those issues then meant that we were even more constrained or even more exposed.
So to use an old sort of idiom, the idea that when England catches cold, Scotland sneezes, yes, because we are affected by whatever they cut in terms of funding because of, yes, the Barnett formula, which funds our own NHS. So we, yes, cannot ring fence the money for our own NHS while we're within the union.
Yes, basically evil didn't work. Evil was a failure. Federalism, if it's replaced with something like that, will not work. That's not a viable option. The only viable option, the only solution is independence for Scotland, in my opinion.
Well, which remains to be seen, Brian. I mean, other people obviously have other opinions on this, but okay, let's move on. Okay, now we are coming up to our next story, and the Chancellor is apparently coming after the pensions triple lock. The SNP has warned that the Tory government is planning to betray pensioners across the UK by scrapping the triple lock on pensions and breaking yet another manifesto commitment. The warning comes after the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, today refused to rule out scrapping the triple lock, stating that there were concerns over going ahead with the planned rise in state pensions. The UK has already one of the lowest state pensions in the developed world, both in absolute terms and also by comparison with average earnings. It also spends less on pensions as a proportion of gross domestic product than the majority of OECD OECD countries. Separately, new research revealed that the UK's pensions are the least generous of every country in North West Europe in comparison to average wage. The House of Commons Library analysis showing that UK pensioners receive around a quarter, in fact 28% of the average working wage when they retire. In stark contrast, pensioners in Luxembourg and Austria receive 90% of the average working wage. Now, I know this is probably not a surprise to you, Brian, but Rishi Sunak was promising, or had promised before he was elected, that they would protect the so-called triple lock, which basically keeps pace with inflation. But there is a planned rise, or was a planned rise until he said this, projected at being 8%. Now, it's not a huge rise, and it has a lot of time to catch up with, hasn't it, as well, because of COVID and other factors. But if he withdraws it, it is a betrayal, isn't it, of all the promises he's made to British pensioners?
Very much so. It was a manifesto pledge, a Tory manifesto pledge, and it looks like it's another manifesto pledge which is just going to be ignored and broken. And as you said, the Tories say that they want that. They're worried that they might be. They don't want to be seen to be catching up with our neighbours in the European Union. It's almost as if
a race to the bottom.
Yes, it's almost as if they're. We can't have this after years of austerity.
We want poverty.
Yes, and the triple lock. I mean, I think it was. It says that state pensions would rise by whichever was the highest, either inflation or earnings, or 2.5%, whichever happened to be the highest.
Yeah, I think it was RPI, Retail Prices Index, or something.
Yes, and I think the government also said today that they're worried about fairness both for pensioners and for taxpayers. But ultimately, at the end of the day, pensioners and taxpayers, they're the same.
Eventually a taxpayer will become a pensioner.
Yeah, so not 100%, but yes, it's
in fact some taxpayers are pensioners because they're still having to work because the pension's so low.
Yes, and so why not just have fairness for both, because they're mostly going to be the same person. So it's just fairness, and that's what they're trying to avoid. They just do not want. And this is one of the strange things I couldn't quite get my head around today. Apparently, the whole reason for this concern that pensions are going to rise by too much has been because of COVID. A lot of the jobs that have been lost have been low earning jobs, and productivity's gone up. So people's profits have gone up, and so the economy, ironically, seems to be doing quite well, which then would mean that of the three, inflation, earnings, or 2.5%, then
whichever
earnings will be the highest.
Yeah.
So they want to scrap the triple lock so that they don't have to go by the higher figure of the three. Again, it's just...
It's all down to the redistribution of wealth, isn't it? Because when the country is doing well, then the pensioners should also do well.
Yes.
Except that they want to stop that.
Yeah, it's just classic Westminster sophistry, and...
just keep cutting lots of little cuts so nobody notices.
Yes,
until it's too late.
Yes, and again, after so many years of austerity, to suggest this, it's concerning.
It makes you wonder, actually, if any of the pensioners who voted for the Conservative Party are bothered by this. It remains to be seen, I guess.
Yes, we could find out if we have an election or
whether they still feel as enthusiastic as they did before. Well, anyway, the Tory government's record on cuts is about to get worse, it seems. The Scottish Children's Commissioner has warned the £20 universal credit uplift cut will be catastrophic. The Children's Commissioner for Scotland has warned that Tory plans to cut universal credit by £20 a week would be catastrophic for families and would effectively knock out the benefits that the Scottish Child Payment brings. The SNP Westminster leader, Ian Blackford MP, today repeated calls for the Chancellor to publish an urgent impact assessment of the effect the planned Tory cuts to universal credit will have on household incomes and the levels of poverty and inequality, warning that cuts will reverse crucial progress being made in Scotland to tackle poverty and send the UK full steam towards a Tory poverty crisis this winter. The report from the Institute for Public Policy Research, published in May, found that the UK's relative poverty rate amongst working households had hit a record high this century of 17.4%, with 1 in 6 working households now languishing in poverty on Boris Johnson's watch. Now, it's almost as if, Brian, they want people to be poor, and for some reason they draw no distinction between working adults and the children of these adults, but it's always the children who end up suffering, isn't it? Because they're at the bottom of the food chain when it comes to money and to tax credits. The children don't get anything really.
Yes, I read an estimation today that this was going to affect something like 400,000 children in the UK. 6 million people in total, adults included.
A full tenth of the British population almost.
Yes, and again, if I've understood this correctly, it's not even as if this is for people who are unemployed and relying on benefits. I think, am I right in saying this is for people who are in work?
I believe so, yes.
Or it was brought
universal credit can be paid to those in low wage employment.
And it was increased during COVID, is that right? And now that they think that COVID's gone, or will be gone any minute now,
so
just
people
take
could
away
just get out there and work even harder than they are at the moment.
Yeah, it just seems it's so unfair, desperately unfair. I mean, that life is unfair, but £20.
It's nothing.
It's nothing. Yes,
it's not going to buy you breakfast at Westminster.
No, and yet it's a huge amount for those families. You know, if you take that £20 away, then that's. Just think of how many groceries you can get.
Oh,
for
£20 would feed up to 4 children for a week if you eked it out.
Yeah, or if you're having to pay for public transport to get to work and the like, and packed lunches. It's for a government to take away such a modest amount. It's going to have a huge effect. And again, that means more people, I think we discussed this before, and more people are going to have to rely on food banks, which again, every time I hear the word food banks, I'm reminded of all those Conservative or Tory MPs and MSPs who turn up smiling and to be photographed as a photo opportunity when they open another food bank in their community.
As though it's some kind of success
as if it's an amenity, as if it's like a sports centre or a community hall. Or
we should be proud of these plucky British food bank people.
Food banks are a disaster, they're a disgrace. And yet, so again, it's just the impact is going to be more food bank use, another disgrace.
Well, let's leave this the subject of food banks for a moment, and again, a story involving the UK government. The United Kingdom government says it will not align with EU law to help solve the Northern Ireland crisis. The UK will not adopt European Union legislation on agri-foods to solve difficulties with post-Brexit trade in Northern Ireland, Brexit Minister David Frost said today, urging Brussels to be more flexible to end a so-called sausage war. Earlier this week, the EU said that London should seriously consider a Swiss-style veterinary agreement with Brussels on agri-foods, which would eliminate the need for checks over certain goods moving between Britain and Northern Ireland, and would improve trade across the whole of the UK within the EU. It seems such a simple thing to ask. All you have to do is sign on the dotted line here this veterinary agreement, and all of these troubles could go away. So why is the British government so dead set on making this a big problem? Well, what's the point?
Is it so simple? I honestly don't know, because I believe it would mean probably more vets would be required at ports to make those checks on the foods.
More employment, perhaps, is a plus there.
Yeah, but it takes something like 7 years to train a vet or something like that, and a lot of the vets that we had before were EU.
I've just been told, Brian, that it wouldn't actually involve more vets. Oh. It would involve no vets.
No vets,
because you only need the vets when you have to check the...
Oh, I understand. Yes, so the agreement would mean that we don't... Yes. Okay,
so, in fact, that it would cost less.
Okay.
That's what it seems.
Let me latch on then to the phrase sausage wars, which annoys me.
It does trivialise this, doesn't it?
Yes, because it makes it... Well, for a start, I know for a fact that Ireland makes great sausages on their own.
Yes, I buy them
They don't need
myself.
British sausages. Irish sausages are very tasty. And this thing about it trivialises it when Westminster and the mainstream media talk about sausage wars, because it basically has nothing or very little to do with sausages. This is about food standards, of which sausages are a part. So this is the EU protecting its borders. They do not want substandard foods to find their way across into the EU,
which
via
of course has
Northern
an open
Ireland.
border for trade
Yes,
with the North.
as was the deal that Northern Ireland would be able to trade with the EU via Ireland and with the UK simultaneously at the same time. So it's complicated, but ultimately the EU still has to protect its borders. So they're right to take that stand, and as it's Britain's fault for voting Brexit that this has arisen. So Britain should be the side that does something about it. If the EU has suggested or offered a solution, we should take it. But
do you think this is mostly about, sort of public point scoring? It's plucky Britain versus evil empire of the EU, and how nasty they're being just because Britain's voted to leave.
British exceptionalism, and they're being so unfair to us, even though it was our decision to leave. It's incredible to watch it unfold in this way. MPs in Westminster were told that this would happen, this kind of thing would happen.
They must have known this, surely.
Yes.
Anybody with a modicum of intelligence would have known this would happen.
Yes, and as with Grant Shapps and the HGV drivers, when we were told that there would be a shortage, and yet they just continue to blame the EU and say that
it's as if the British government has continued its strong-arm negotiations, even though the deal has already been done.
Yes,
they're still trying to modify it.
And we should still want to trade with the EU, so they should be talking to the EU. And as I said earlier, if the EU, if they can pinpoint a solution, if you do this, then that problem will go away. We really should be open to consider that at least.
There's this sectarian and political element to this story as well, because many of the unionist minority, despite the fact that they've retained their British citizenship and can stick Union Jacks on anything they like, they're now feeling like they're part of a greater Ireland, and this is beginning to worry them somewhat, despite the fact that they are still part of the UK. Do you think that the British government even cares whether there is a restart of the Troubles, or if there are bombing campaigns on mainland Ireland? Do you think that would bother Boris Johnson?
It should bother Boris Johnson, but I think you're right, it probably won't. The very fact that they would blatantly lie before saying that there would not be a border in the Irish Sea, and now we have a border in the Irish Sea, they just seem to be...
They promise anything to anybody to get the job done, and then basically just renege on
and
it
then just,
as soon as it is expedient.
And whatever consequences, just shrug their shoulders and move on. It's incredible how they continue to get away with it, actually. But then I suppose with maybe the DUP, they're not in the best organised state at the moment. And
of course, famously this week, when the leader of the DUP in the House of Commons got up to ask the Prime Minister a question, Boris Johnson had already walked out of the chamber.
Really?
Very reminiscent of the treatment that the SNP speakers often get. But to see it now, the Prime Minister is basically the leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party snubbing the Ulster Unionists is not something I've seen before.
Yeah, I think the DUP in Northern Ireland in general are of no consequence to Westminster. The population's the smallest out of the four parts of the Union. So if Scotland and Wales can be ignored, then
Northern Ireland.
But the consequences are immense.
Well, I'm old enough to remember the mainland bombing campaign by IRA in the UK.
Yeah, likewise. And I'm of Irish descent, and we used to go to Ireland every year for our summer holidays. And I remember, as a child, the car would stop at the border. We would be going just over the border into County Monaghan, in the south of Ireland, and there would be soldiers with machine guns would come in. we would open the car doors. They would go through our luggage in the boot, and my dad had a strong Irish accent, but we had a British license plate.
Mm-hmm.
But when they heard his accent, that just it was incredible. And telling people that didn't go to, they might have been our age, but they didn't go to Ireland at that time, or younger people who don't remember it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and that was on an ordinary day. That was just, when there wasn't any trouble over the border at that time. So it could well escalate if Westminster does not pay attention. And so it's alarming, and to say the least.
Okay. Well, Brian, listen, we have to leave that story there just now. This time we're moving the conversation. Well, let's stay with the British government again, but this time we're talking about Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein. The United Kingdom has signed a trade deal with these three countries. The UK government has announced that it signed a free trade deal with Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein today. Its latest post-Brexit trade agreement. The deal covers sectors including digital, financial, professional business services and has cut tariffs for British exports, the Trade Ministry said. The signing of the deal today followed an agreement in principle reached last month. Now, I don't know about you, Brian, but I happen to know that these three countries are all members of the European Free Trade Association, which are small countries which trade into and out of the EU freely but are not members. Do you think there's any significance in the fact that the British have approached these three particular countries as a group?
Yes, another thing they all have in common is I think that they're all independent. But
it's worth pointing that out, Brian. Yes, definitely.
Sure. I don't know, what can I say? Again, this is Liz Truss's handiwork, I believe. And although I've seen some official comments from Norway to say that this is great, we're working with Britain, but I've seen other comments from Norwegian politicians and ministers which said, well, this deal that we've just signed with the UK, it's okay. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's not as good as the deal that we had when Britain was part of the EU, and so it's a net loss for the UK, I think. There will be lots of...
Britain seems to be having a great deal of trouble locating large, prosperous countries with which to sign trade deals. And it seems to be picking off all the small fry, the low-hanging fruit at the moment.
Yeah.
Do you think they're going to have more troubles in future trying to gain trade agreements with larger countries and blocks of countries?
I've got images of Father Ted ringing in my head, and I'm trying to resist, about small economies far away, and
yes,
as opposed to larger economies being nearby in the EU. It's just the fact that they can hold up something like this as a win for the UK. Look, Brexit is working.
Is it reminiscent of Neville Chamberlain climbing off the plane from Berlin, waving a piece of paper?
Yeah,
claiming that peace was being declared between Britain and Germany when no such thing was happening.
Yes, and so I suppose that means that the next stage would be you've never had it so good.
I've heard the phrase "the Roaring Twenties" being bandied about by Tory politicians now.
Oh, I've missed that one.
This is the latest buzzword that we're entering the Roaring Twenties. Oh. As obviously a reference to the 1920s.
Oh, I thought maybe it was a reference to a house fire or something, or like burning down the economy. And it's. I don't think there's anything that is going to be able to disguise how bad Brexit is. We had a great trade deal with countries in EFTA as well as in the EU, and it's gone now. And it's I just can't see it coming back.
The blinkers are off the public now, and as soon as the COVID restrictions are lifted and that mist clears, everybody will be able to see exactly the problems that Brexit is creating.
Yeah, there's only one way to get as good a deal as the deal we had, and that is to join the EU. And again, maybe a bit obviously to say that, but so Scotland should do that on their own. We just need to.
So leave Brexit land and become independent and rejoin the EU if we wish.
Yes.
Okay, well, let's move on to Hungary now. And Hungary's teachers are defiant as anti-LGBT laws come into force. Hungary's new anti-LGBT law, which comes into force on Thursday, has caused anxiety in the LGBT community and added uncertainty to life under the nationalist Prime Minister Viktor Orban's government, which has stepped up its campaign against LGBT people ahead of elections next year. Orban, who has been in power since 2010, has grown increasingly right-wing on social policy in what he portrays as a fight to safeguard the traditional Christian values from Western liberalism. The Hungarian law says that under 18s cannot be shown pornographic content or any content that encourages gender reassignment or homosexuality. It also proposes setting up a list of groups allowed to hold sex education sessions in schools. Filegi Valta runs an extracurricular workshop which discusses LGBT issues and supports children in handling problems in their private lives. From a scientific standpoint, I would be lying if I did not tell children about the existence of homosexuality and transsexuality. But this does not mean I would be promoting these issues, he said. We will not exercise self-censorship. The law, which has drawn condemnation across Western Europe, says that teachers found violating it could face as yet unspecified penalties, which will be defined later. This seems like a massive retrograde step for any European country, and it must be ringing alarm bells in the EU as well, with Hungary being so close to the centre of Europe.
Yes, it's quite unsettling, isn't it? And if you're like me, then as soon as any politician starts to talk about things like Christian values, then I start to pay attention. It's just makes me very nervous when they begin to talk about religion in terms of what really should be a secular issue. And Viktor Orban's plans, it's a retrograde step. And I was reading a quote from a Hungarian teacher by the name of Floris Filegi-Balta.
Yes, it's the lady we were talking about a moment ago.
Yes,
sorry, the gentleman. I think is the gentleman.
Yeah, who is transitioning, and so is trans or will be trans.
Yes,
and she said that simply by turning up at work, she will be breaking these laws and these rules. Fortunately, it seems that at the moment, teachers, schools are saying that they won't
apply these rules,
yes,
or they will refuse.
But will they be able to if it's against the law, and what are the consequences going to be?
I'm not sure about the rules regarding union membership of teachers in Hungary, but if they have a union and the teachers agree that they don't want to do this, a mass strike, what are they going to do? Lock up all the teachers?
Yes, but then that would rely on the union agreeing with the teachers and supporting the teachers if they take that kind of action. But hopefully they would.
Because if that doesn't work, we're talking about something like The Handmaid's Tale here. We're talking about a really authoritarian religious state, which is basically making anything which is not heterosexual illegal, and punishing anybody they catch, either talking about it or even discussing it amongst themselves.
It's incredible in this day and age, and it's very reminiscent of Clause 28.
Yeah.
And that's gone, but from here. But even in conservative Britain, Tory Britain, we realised that Clause 28 eventually was a bad idea, but it looks like Hungary and Viktor Orban are going down that route of their own accord. I don't. Oh, and there's an election coming up, isn't there, as well? So again,
yes, next year, I believe.
Yeah,
so he's obviously trying to curry some popular favour.
He's pandering to a certain sector of the population, which again sounds very much like some parts of this country, in Westminster,
and monstering and demonising a small minority of people in the process.
Yeah, it's incredible, and again, I'm just unsettling. I keep saying that tonight. It's unsettling. It's a
worrying development, isn't it? It feels like a step back to pre-World War II days, doesn't it?
And it does make you wonder: should the EU? Well, maybe they are diplomatically quietly behind scenes. So,
if you don't stop doing this, we're going to boot you out.
Yes, there will be consequences. But then who knows?
So, of course, that would be
struggling.
financial sanctions that the European Union will apply, I would imagine. They're not very direct when it comes to...
Yeah, and yet they do say that each country in the European Union is independent, and that's why they try
Because
not to
Hungary
interfere.
receives a lot of funding
But-
from the EU as well, I believe.
I would imagine so. Yeah.
That could be threatened if Orban continues with this.
Yes.
Well, we'll await the developments, Brian, see what
Yes.
happens next. Anyway, back to Scotland for our next story, and funding for community drugs projects. Grants worth a total of £1.61 million have been allocated to community-based drug organisations and support services, providing access to treatment and residential rehabilitation. The local support fund for groups with an annual income of just £1 million issued 24 awards. Recipients included the Navigator project, run by Medics Against Violence, which will get £37,256 to help patients who attend emergency departments to access appropriate local services after discharge. Grants of up to £100,000 were awarded to 17 organisations under the Improvement Fund, which supports services leading to fast access to treatment, residential rehabilitation, and initiatives which help drug users address the underlying challenges they face. The Moving On project in Inverclyde, which provides counselling for people in recovery, was amongst the successful applicants. This round of funding is from the £18 million package announced in March to support the national mission and to reduce drug-related deaths and improve lives. Again, a good news story from the Scottish Government, which seems to, unlike its counterparts in London, really care about people who, let's face it, most of us have abandoned all hope of being able to help.
Yes, it is good news, and again, I think it's an indicator of the difference between the administrations north and south of the border. It's probably not enough, really.
Never is enough, is it? Yeah. The trouble with drugs is it's endemic everywhere at the moment.
Yeah, people win more on the lottery than
you get in an
has
award.
been allocated, but still, I'm sure it will make a huge difference, and it's not quite, mitigation isn't quite the right word, but it kind of is the Scottish Government.
But it is a reactionary position to take, isn't it? You're actually having to pick up the pieces caused by the fact that we're not allowed to legislate on Class A drugs, how they're misused and how to help people who are addicted at the moment without actually being criminalised ourselves.
Exactly. I mean, I kind of think it's similar to knife crime and how that was tackled in Scotland.
Multi-institution
yes, and
groups and the third sector all working together.
Absolutely, and bringing in not just stopping search and looking for people carrying knives, but treating it as a holistic issue.
Yeah, I remember the education programme as well. They went around schools as well and talked to children about why carrying a knife is not going to protect you. It's just going to make you more likely to be involved in an incident.
Yes, but so the thing is, I think that Scotland wants to do something similar with its drugs problem, and we can't do it because we are being held back by Westminster. They won't let Scotland bring in the changes that Scotland wants to make.
Because decriminalising such drug use would end the stigma and allow people who have drug addictions to be treated and also to be treated in clean, safe environments instead of in the shady, dirty and dangerous areas that they're forced to inhabit at the moment.
Yes, and it sounds like these sums of money are going to local projects that are have strong connections to the local community. They'll know where and how this money is best spent, rather than Holyrood coming in and just...
It's just a pity there's not more of it.
Yes. One day. Okay,
on to our final story this evening, another good news story from Scotland, and that is that applicants to Scottish universities are set at a record high. Scottish universities have seen a record number of prospective students applying to study for the academic year ahead, according to new figures from the Universities and Colleges Admission Service, UCAS. The number of individuals applying to Scottish institutions increased by 10% to 140,440. The figures show the number of Scottish applicants from the most deprived areas applying to UK providers has increased by 11%, and there has been a 23% rise in non-EU international applicants. This year's statistics also highlight a 41% decrease in applicants based in EU countries looking to study in Scotland. Well, I think we could have predicted that one, Brian, that obviously EU students are not going to be feeling terribly safe about the idea of studying in Scotland at some of the best universities we have.
Yes, it's bittersweet in a sense. The number of applicants are up, and yet we've lost so many students from EU countries. The irony. I suppose to try and take the best from that story, it shows that the Scottish education system and the fact that education is free is, well, for Scottish students or people living in Scotland. I'm getting mixed up here. It's positive that people want to come to Scotland to learn and to go to university and to study and to live here. And that kind of, I suppose, bucks the trend of what you might expect post-Brexit. So I suppose it shows that people have a confidence in Scotland and they want to be here.
There has, Brian, been a trend towards more students from other parts of the United Kingdom coming to Scotland to get their education here because they know that it's such a good place. Now, obviously, they can't access the free education that Scottish residents can, but they're still coming, aren't they? They're still coming to Scottish universities to study.
They will be able to access those benefits if they decide to stay here after their degree and get a job, and then they would be welcome to benefit from
the free prescriptions and all the rest of it. Free dental
social
care, I believe, is going to be
social care, yes.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that is perhaps part of the reasons behind the trend, and I wonder if people are looking at how things are south of the border and how things are north of the border, and when they're deciding what could become a long-term decision, they're saying, I'm going to Scotland, that's where I want to be, rather than in England.
Perhaps see it as a safer, more humane
yes.
place to live.
I wonder if somebody could maybe commission a poll.
That would be interesting, of students.
To find out why students are choosing Scotland. Again, I don't know what the comparative figures would be for England, but I do wonder about people from outside the EU. International students are more of them coming to Scotland
Well,
than
we've certainly
England,
seen a massive building programme of luxury accommodation for overseas students from Southeast Asia, from China particularly, where there's a massive middle-class generation of basically single children without any siblings, so their parents, I guess, can lavish a lot of money on their education and seem to value the Scottish degree system very highly.
Yes, and I know from friends who work in Scottish universities that sector has been hit very badly by Brexit, by students leaving, so they take their funds with them. So if those funds are being replaced, then that means that universities are going to be in a better position, perhaps, than we thought we would be.
So it sounds perhaps like Scottish universities are far more adaptable than we might have thought, given the circumstances they've been faced with.
Yes, and also, but then the ideal benefit would be if we could have more students from outside the EU, but also students from inside the EU. Why not have both? There's a reason why we can't have both.
Yeah, I was going to say it would be very simple for the British government to come up with a system which gives exemptions to people who want to study here from Europe. It wouldn't take a great deal of homework for Priti Patel to create a doorway, shall we say, for students, because Erasmus is over and we can't do the exchanges anymore, but it seems a shame that we're shutting out people who want to study here.
Yes, and again, you mentioned Erasmus, and it's been replaced by an alternative British scheme, which is not as good and less adequate.
And not funded properly, as far as I understand it.
And I know it sounds like I keep bringing every question back to the same solution, but if Scotland was independent, then we would be able to make our own decisions, have our own policies. yes, attract people from whichever part of the world we wanted them to without having to worry about the consequences of things like Brexit.
Or having Priti Patel turn up with some guys in black jackets to take your students away.
Yes, in big vans.
Yeah. Well, listen, we have run out of time, Brian, but as usual, thank you for being such an erudite guest. And it just remains for me to remind our viewers that we're still in the middle of our crowdfunder at the moment. So if you enjoy the programmes and you'd like to see more of them and you would like to help us with that, you can do that by becoming a regular supporter for just £5 a month. If you can't afford that, then you can always make a single donation or even volunteer to work here in the studio. But as I said, this is my last programme as an anchor here, at least for the time being. And so I want to thank the viewers for sticking with me for over 2 years in this position, and say best of luck to whoever is replacing me. I don't know if it will be you, Brian, but we do have some new talent coming up through the ranks.
I'd fear for the viewers if it was me. I'm not sure. I'm sure, but you will be missed, absolutely.
Well, I'll certainly miss the place. I'll have fond memories to take with me. But anyway, regardless of all of that, we're at the end of our time for this evening. So thank you very much for watching, and have a good night to you.
Haste you back.